So welcome to my Wednesday lunchtime live on joining bias binding. So I'm going to talk to you about how you can make a join when you're using bias binding to finish off a neckline. So when you're going and in the round, okay? So for the demo, I'm not going to be in the round, but you'll get the kind of gist of how we're going to make the join, and I'm going to show you a couple of different approaches. So one is using bias that is what I would call a single fold, and the other one is using a pre-made bias that is what I would call a double fold. So both of them will work equally well, but they're just slightly different approaches, and I'll also tell you how you can join together a bias strip. What is bias binding? Essentially, bias is at 45 degrees to the selvage. So you've got two options. You can make your own, which is a great way of using up scraps of fabric, and it's also a great way, let's say you've got a very lightweight garment and you don't want to use a binding or a finish that's heavier. Making your own binding in the same fabric means that you're matching that weight, and it's a great finish. So if you don't know what I mean, you can go and check out my using bias binding as a neck finish, I think it's called. I will link to it below, but I've done a whole Facebook Live just on finishing off the neckband with a bias as a facing. So bias is very slightly stretchy because we don't cut it on the straight of grain, we cut it at 45 degrees to the selvage, and it's just a nice way of kind of finishing edges. Sometimes you can use bias as a contrast, and you can buy pre-made bias. So I'm going to show you a pre-made for one of these little demos. So we're going to take a little look first of all at joining together bias strips. So when you cut out bias, you cut it at 45 degrees to the selvage. That is your true bias grain, and what it does is it allows a little bit of stretch, which is perfect for going around curves and things like that. All right, so I'm not going to be doing the whole demo on how to apply this. I'm just going to be showing you some tips for making joins when you're sewing it in the round, for example around a neckline or an armhole. We have got our bias strips. So these have been cut at 45 degrees to the selvage, so they're very slightly stretchy. So you can see it's got a little bit of give in there, not a lot of give. It doesn't make it suddenly a really stretchy fabric, but there's a little bit more give than if we cut it on the straight of grain. And that's because if you look at these sort of lines, imagine that the vertical lines are my fibers being stretched when the fabric is woven, and then these horizontal lines are wrapped around those vertical threads. What happens if you cut at 45 degrees, you're cutting in the space between those taut threads, and that's what allows it a little bit of give, okay? So that's why bias grain is always slightly stretchy. So when we come to join these, we've got cut out a couple of strips, and you might be thinking, okay, brilliant, I'm just going to join these together. So you pin at the seam, and then when you open that out, what you've ended up with, obviously I didn't put that right sides together, but you've ended up with a corner. So when we join bias binding or bias strips, we need to make a slightly different seam. So we'll take a look at how you join the strips. So first up, I've got one of my strips at this 45 degrees, and then with the right sides together, I'm going to take the other strip and line that up at 45 degrees. Now, it's very important that we have a little corner here that is our seam allowance, because if I try to stitch this like so, and I'm going to pin it in place for you, what happens is this edge, can you see we've got a bit of a step? So we need to make an allowance for our seam allowance, and the way to do that is to just slide this along so that this length here, this little corner, is your seam allowance. Let's say I'm going to do 1 centimetre, and then if I pin like so, that is going to make sure that our edges are now aligned. So you've got that little kind of triangle here, and this length is the seam allowance that you're going to do the join in your bias strips with. Okay, so you'd stitch that together. You can give it a little finger press open, or you can even use the iron. And then that diagonal seam makes it very discreet, and you don't notice that you've got a join in your bias. I'd usually cut off my little piggy ears once I've joined it. So that's how you join together short pieces of bias to make a longer piece. So you can make it, it can be quite economical, and you can use up little scraps. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at using a pre-made bias binding that's got what I would call a double fold. And again, in the previous video that I've done on using bias as a facing, I talked about pre-shrinking this into the curved shape. But essentially I've already done how you can use the iron to make this shrink into a nice curve, which is always going to give you a much better finish when you're using bias as a facing. Okay, so I will link you to that previous video. So we're going to just have a couple of ends as if I had gone all the way around. So we've got our neckline. Usually we would have, you know, this would have been joined at the shoulders, and we're going all the way around. This is what I call a double folded bias, because we've got a fold here and a fold here. Sometimes this is called single fold, but I refer to a single fold as being folded with just one fold. So I'm going to show you that technique in a minute. So I've got my bias, I've shrunk it into a nice curve, I've pinned it all the way around my neckline, and what I've got now is that I'm coming to the point where I need to make a join. So we're going to pretend that I've done this. So we've got this all pinned into place. And we're going to come up to the point where we need a join. So pre-shrinking makes this much easier to go around this curve. So make your bias, cut it longer than you need. Okay, and the reason why I don't do my join before I apply it is that as you're working around the curve, the bias can stretch sometimes, and if you've already made your join, you might find that it's too long, or you might find that it's too short. So usually I will be doing this all the way around my neckline, and then I'm going to end up with a little bit of space where I need to make this join. So you need a good bit of excess at either end. And the reason for that is I'm going to do a diagonal join. And by a diagonal join, I mean exactly what I just did in these strips. I want my join to be at a diagonal. That is the straight of grain, and that's going to make it lie much flatter. So you can do a sort of 90-degree join, but I prefer to always give myself a diagonal join. So I'm going to pretend that this is in the round. Okay, so I've pinned all the way around my neckline, and now I need to come in and make my join. So I'm going to fold this at 90 degrees. So see that little 90 degrees there, and give yourself a little finger fold mark, and then the piece over the top, I'm going to go at 90 degrees in the opposite way. Okay, like so. So essentially I'm going to be joining these two bits together. So you need to release a few of the pins that you placed in around the neckline, and I can match up those little finger creases that I put in, like so. Okay. In fact, I'm just going to line this up and give myself a nice little right angle here. So I've released it enough that I can pin in this join. and then you can test it before you trim anything. Make sure that it still sits in nicely, that it's not too big and bulky. And then I'm just going to give that a little trim, like so. And I'm not going to stitch it right now, but I would normally stitch this in place, just finger press that open, and now I'm ready to go and sew my neckline in place. So we're going to pin this so you can see how this would look. So when the join rolls over, can you see that it's at that diagonal, which means it's sort of a lot more discreet, and it will disappear rather than being at sort of a straight line like that. And then that's how you make a join when you are using a double folded bias like this commercially bought one. Okay, so it's a really nice and easy way of kind of doing a join in the bias. Okay, so I always prefer to create my join at a diagonal because it sort of disappears a little bit more than if you were to put a join sort of at a kind of 90 degrees to your seam line. Okay, so the next type of bias join that we're going to look at, again we're going to pretend that we're doing this in the round, is if we were using it as a single fold where we have just folded our self bias, or if we are using a commercial bias binding, you can fold that in place. So we're not going to have those two folded edges, we're just going to have a single one. This is my favourite way to do a bias binding, but it can make it a little bit tricky for the joining bit. So for this technique, I've got my bias strip and then I've folded it once, wrong sides together, pressed that in place, and usually I might put a basting stitch to hold this together. Now again, make it longer than you need. You can measure your neckline so you've got a bit of an idea, but don't do the basting all the way to the end. So I'm not going to baste this just because for speed, for the demo. So I'm just going to pin this together. Okay. And again, I would normally steam this into shape so that I know that it's going to hold that curve. So I've got the other half, so I've gone all the way around and I'm coming back to create my join. And again, I'm just going to pin baste this, but I would usually do a little bit of a baste holding this in place on the sewing machine, because then I've given myself a really nice guide. So we're coming back here, we've pinned all of this into position, and we're coming up to making our join. Okay, so for this method, creating that diagonal seam can be a bit confusing, because we've got 2 layers of fabric here and 2 layers of fabric here. Kind of opening it all out and joining it together can feel a little bit confusing. So depending on your fabric type, if you want to do a really quick, what I would call cheap and nasty, you can just do a seam through these layers, through the 2 layers there and the 2 layers there. But what that would mean is that you're going to end up with seam allowance like this, which may poke out of the top. So I would only really do it like this if I really had to get something finished, okay? But what we are going to do is you just release enough. So again, you can give yourself a little press or a finger press where you want that join to be. And this time we are going to put the join at kind of 90 degrees to our centre back. Okay, so I finger mark where that joins. Finger mark where that joins. and then just release it enough so we can open up our folded bias like so, and match up those little finger creases that we popped in. So I'm not attempting to do any kind of diagonal seam this time. I'm just doing a kind of vertical seam like so. And again, before you trim anything away, you can come in and just check this. Maybe I need to make that join a little bit closer. It feels a little bit big. And that's okay. When you're happy that this is in the right spot, you're going to stitch, then trim, then press open like so. The join has been stitched at 90 degrees to the neck edge, and then once you've made that join, just press that out, and now you can make that back into the single fold again. And like I said, I would normally have sort of steam pressed this into a curve so that it fits the shape of my neckline or my armhole exactly, and that way it will lie really nice and flat when you come to stitch this in. So I'm just going to release that like so. So now the bias has been joined, and you're ready to apply the bias all the way around the neck. So this version, we do have a seam at 90 degrees. So it can, because that's actually then on the bias, it can look a little bit lumpier, but it will be fine for this because it's very tricky to work out how to do the diagonal here. I just wanted to show you those two different methods. So here, we used a double folded bias and we made a diagonal join, and in this one on the single fold we've made a 90 degree join or a straight join. So hopefully that will help you when you are using bias as a neckline facing, or when you're using bias as any kind of a finish, to work out how you make put it into a ring or join it in the round. Thank you for joining me on your Wednesday lunchtime to watch my tips and tricks for joining bias in the round. All right, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, gang, and I'll see you soon.